Good afternoon. Um, I'd like to thank you for joining us in the Algorithmic Discrimination legal technical paper session. I'm really excited about the lineup of papers that we have. First, we're going to get started with gender animus can still exist under favorable disparate impact with the presenter, Judong.
Hello everyone. Okay. Uh, I'm Shudon. I'm happy to be here to share with you the paper titled Gender Animus Can Still Exist Under Favorable Disparate Impact. Okay. Okay. So this paper, we obtain backend data from one of the companies which operate one of the largest peer-to-peer lending networks back in China. And so P2P lending is basically an online platform where everyone can go there and write a description of why you need to make a certain loan. And you self-specify the amount and also the interest rate that you're willing to pay for your loan. And then everyone can go on this platform and invest their money in your loans. And it's also a crowdfunding platform. So a borrower's loan can be funded by a set of unlimited number of investors, as long as the total money from investors will cover the amount that you requested for. So this is the platform that we audited in this paper. And particularly, we are interested in measuring gender discrimination in this P2P lending platform. We measure, well, there are a line of work trying to discuss gender discrimination in P2P lending, but previous work tend to focus on the notion that is based on disparate treatment, which means direct discrimination. Basically, you have to prove a direct causal effect of gender on the funding success, and if by controlling for other loan and borrower characteristics, if these characteristics can explain the disparity between gender on loans funding success, then these disparity are not being recognized as gender discrimination. But here we take a broadened view of gender discrimination. We set out to measure disparate impact on this P2P lending platform. So by disparate impact, we mean that any disparity that cannot be reasonably related to the very narrow business necessity goal. And to interpret this, one of the classic examples is just the landmark Greeks versus Duke Power Company, where the companies standardize the testing requirement, which is neutral in its form, but still produce adverse effect to the black employees, and thus is still considered illegal in the case. So formally, in our P2P lending context, we define the disparate impact to be the difference in the funding success of male and female borrowers' loans, narrowly controlling for the loans' return rates. In doing so, normatively, we argue that the only legitimate discriminating factor in P2P lending is the loan's return rate. We do not consider the amount of the loan to be a legitimate discriminating factor, because in our platform, the investor, they can choose themselves freely what is the amount that you are interested in giving to every loan. And that is our definition of disparate impact in this P2P lending context. So we basically developed an estimation strategy. The main difficulty in our estimation is that we only have observational data, which has this fundamental unobservability of the return rate of the unfunded loans in this platform. So we decided to produce model-based estimates of return rates of those potential outcomes, and we condition on those potential outcomes, we estimate the disparate impact of loans between male and female borrowers. And our estimate produced in our paper is that we find female borrowers are actually more likely to be funded in their loans in this P2P lending platform. And we did a contrast between disparate impact and disparate treatment. We found that disparate impact indeed reveal a larger female favoritism on our platform than disparate treatment would imply to us. And since we do have a set of loan and borrower characteristics in our data, we can additionally control for those characters. And we can also see that the disparate impact, a large portion, around 37%, can be explained by our observed loan and borrower characteristics, which means indeed there is a huge portion of indirect discrimination which is going on this borrower, on this P2P lending platform. So you definitely might be surprised our finding of female being favored on P2P lending, but that is actually not a surprising result in P2P lending because there are already a line of literature whose finding is female are actually being favored or at least equally funded on P2P lending. But what is novel in our finding is that because we focus on disparate impact, which reveal a larger extent of female favoritism in P2P lending. And right. So besides trying to measure gender discrimination, we also try to explore the question of why people discriminate in P2P lending. And but as a disclaimer, we cannot discuss like investor intent in their lending decision. So we instead take a database approach. We try to feed our data to a decision model that we postulate, and we just see which hypothesis fits the best to our data. Okay, we consider two hypotheses for why investors discriminate. One is taste-based discrimination, where the investor have an intrinsic preference in lending to male or female borrowers. The second is statistical discrimination, where the investor does not have an intrinsic value, but instead they're incentivized to use gender as a way to produce more accurate expected return rate estimate. Because if you think about how investors making decisions, they see a bunch of information for each loan, and what they're doing, we model them as inferring, as seeing a noisy signal of the loan's return rate, and they will be using gender information to correct this noisy information in the form of computing the posterior expectation. So in our model, the investor might be involved in both kinds of discrimination, and we use Bayesian inference to infer the decision parameter from this model and try to give a database explanation of why investors discriminate. And the story from the fitted model is that while females are being favored, this favoritism actually can be explained by one particular driver, which is the statistical discrimination driver, which means that the investor, they favor female because female borrowers are factually less likely to default in their P2P loans. So upon observing a noisy signal, it is the rational behavior for the investor to outweigh their return rate because they know from the population statistics that females are more trustworthy. And furthermore, we find the residual taste-based component is still against female. So the interpretation is while we find at the platform level there are around 4% female favoritism, statistical discrimination will actually give you, let's say, we have an estimate in our paper, but roughly 5% favoritism. And there is an additional gender animus component, which is against female around 1%, which reduce the female favoritism that would have been in this P2P lending platform. So we end with the discussions. So the takeaway is P2P lending could be a valuable tool, especially it's only a market behavior, and it's not any heavy-handed quota system. And also, you realize the fact that females are still largely receive unequal access to finance in other parts of markets, so P2P lending could be valuable. The other is to not only establish the existence and also the extent of gender discrimination, but ask the deeper question of why people discriminate. So by diving deeper into why people discriminate, you might find results that are contradictory or surprising to the mere estimate of gender discrimination. And we hope there are already a line of work trying to infer why people discriminate under the term of discrimination drivers. And we hope this could be encouraging sign to people looking into this issue. And thank you.
As you all might have noticed, we'll be saving questions for the end of the session. So our next presenter with multidimensional discrimination in law and machine learning, a comparative review, is Jan Hortzman.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Jan. I'm presenting joint work with Irene Tutsi and Arjun Roy, who couldn't be here. And quick disclaimer, in this work, they are the computer scientists. I'm merely the lawyer sidekick, so forgive me if I will not go into technical details. So we looked at multidimensional discrimination in the law and in machine learning. How does this one work? The green button is like a... This one, sorry. Okay, so multidimensional discrimination, what do we mean by that? So discrimination and also fair machine learning and anti-discrimination law always relies on categories. We call them protected attributes in machine learning. We call them discrimination grounds in the law. And what has been observed and what was our starting point is that these grounds or attributes cannot always be defined in isolation, but they interact in real life. And this has been pointed out by Kimberly Crenshaw in her seminal work on intersectionality in the 1980s. She focused especially on the marginalization of Black women at the time by anti-discrimination law and policy. And legal literature especially has worked on this and has built on this and developed a typology of the ways that these categories that we use can interact, starting with intersectional discrimination in a narrow sense, where on these, well, you can imagine them as axes in a multidimensional coordinate system. These categories interact in a way that specifically disadvantages a certain group, but not others. So as an example, rules on headscarves, for example, at the workplace, disadvantage Muslim women specifically. They do not disadvantage Muslim men, and neither do they disadvantage women in general. So disadvantage is on this group specifically. By contrast, in additive or cumulative discrimination, we have disadvantages on the group at the intersection, but also at the groups that are not at the intersection, but at the axes that make up the intersection. Consider as an example height requirements, for example, in security sector jobs. They will disadvantage Japanese females because they have a very short average height compared to other groups, but they also disfavor females in general because of shorter average height and Japanese in general because of shorter average height. But the strongest impact is on Japanese women. Lastly, a bit different, there is sequential discrimination. This is multiple discrimination, multiple incidents of discrimination on a temporal axis. This is kind of a standard case, and we look at it usually on a case-by-case basis. But of course, if you consider work life, where you have disadvantage in education, later in hiring, and then when competing for a promotion, these disadvantages can compound and add up. So we reviewed the law and computer science for how they react to the multidimensionality of discrimination. And starting with the law, I have brought two cases that have gained prominence and show how the law, well, if it reacts specifically and explicitly to these types of discrimination, it does so rather skeptically. On the left, you see the case of the Graphenread that prompted Kimberly Crenshaw's initial diagnosis because here race and sex discrimination were reviewed in isolation, and that led to the marginalization of Black women as a specific group. And as recently as 2016, EU law had a similar case that was the Paris case, which exhibited structurally very similar reasoning. And yeah, in general, it can be said that the law as it is now, as it stands, does not really reflect this multidimensionality, although it has been pointed out in theory and scholarship a lot. However, practically, cumulative discrimination and sequential discrimination usually can be solved on a case-to-case basis, focusing on one of the involved grounds, but that leaves some things unaddressed. For example, does not reflect the experience of the person who is experiencing discrimination based on a multitude of grounds. And intersectional discrimination, like in the case of David Paris, can or cannot slip through the cracks between these categories. Sometimes it can be dealt with focusing on one dimension. For example, in the cases of headscarves, usually religion is the case, the dimension in the foreground. Because there are some shortcomings in the legal protection, we looked at what fair machine learning is doing, how it is reacting to this. And here, so in the beginning, what we found was that the first approach was looking at isolated categories, looking only at one of these potential protected attributes, and possibly also looking at a couple of them, and by applying some operator, combining the disadvantages that are found in measuring discrimination on a group level or unfairness on a group level. But this, if you ensure fairness this way, this risks ensuring fairness only at the expense of specific subgroups, such as Black females in Crenshaw's example. And yeah, so the literature in machine learning realized this and drew some lessons from intersectionality and started focusing on subgroups. And the nice thing is that by putting the focus on subgroups, cumulative discrimination as well as intersectional discrimination can be addressed because they are similar in this respect on a group level. However, there's a big challenge for focusing on subgroups because it runs into the problem of data scarcity. Even rich demographic data sets like the adult income data set here have very few instances from the subgroups. The finer you go, the worse that gets. And they may also exhibit a severe class imbalance. Looking further to sequential discrimination, the big question here is the temporal component and how to take that into consideration. If someone experiences unfairness at an earlier stage, do we consider that, and how do we consider that at a later stage? For that, one would need stage-wise label information that is not present in many data sets. So from the ML side of things, I think there's the good development and silver lining that work has been done and is being done more and more on this multidimensionality, and that reflects the reality of discrimination much better. However, there are many open questions that are opened up by this debate, and also issues of data scarcity and collecting this rather sensitive data while ensuring privacy. On the legal side of things, it has been an issue for a longer time, and it is still unresolved. However, there is some practical understanding of the matter that is not always reflected in jurisprudence, however. A more general point, however, that I think is brought up by this and that we should take into consideration is that the multidimensionality of these discrimination grounds or protected attributes challenges us to reconsider our definition or construction of these categories that we use all the time to categorize people and their normative underpinnings. Do we need categories or are there better ways to ensure fairness? And we should move beyond categories, at least partially. Yeah, and thank you very much. That's it.
Okay, up next, we have Algorithmic Unfairness Through the Lens of EU Non-Discrimination Law by Hilda. Thank you.
So which green button was it? This one. Excellent. Hi. Hi, everyone. So as opposed to Jan, who just gave his presentation, I'm actually the computer scientist in this team. So for any legal questions, I recommend you to contact my co-authors. Wait, I actually want to go back first. Yeah. So this was a joint work together with my first co-author, Raphael Xenides, as well as Fabien Tarisson, Henrik Bomer-Olsen, and Mikola Pashinitsky. And the idea of this work was to try and bridge some gaps that we noticed between research on algorithmic fairness in computer science and then some discourse in legal scholar communities. And one of the obvious things is, of course, that computer scientists and legal scholars do not really speak the same language, and they also use different types of abstractions. And this can lead to some disciplinary misunderstandings. So when we look at the computer science sides of things, people usually speak of things like bias and fairness, and then a question that often comes up is, okay, I got a fairness metric, so what should be the value of my fairness metric to be compliant with the law? Now, any legal scholar or lawyer will tell you it depends, which is not very insightful for the computer scientist, and raises important questions like what types of bias and unfairness the law addresses when we prohibit discrimination. Then when we look at legal scholarship, here people speak of discrimination and equality. And then a question that sometimes arises to the computer scientists is like, hey, there are biases. Can you please de-bias my system? Which is not very informative for the computer scientists either, because it's not very specific. And this raises different questions, like what the role is of fairness metrics and fairness-aware machine learning algorithms in establishing and achieving legal compliance. So what we tried to do in this work is to sort of connect computer science and law research, and we read some typical cases of algorithmic unfairness that we all use in our slides from the perspective of EU non-discrimination law. And we specifically tried to write this paper in a way such that it's also readable for people who are not really familiar with legal aspects. So if you're a computer scientist and you're interested, then I would definitely recommend reading the full paper. Yes, so maybe a little bit of background on EU non-discrimination law. So there's two main doctrines in EU non-discrimination law. Maybe you've heard of it before. So the first one is direct discrimination. And this is a situation where a person is treated less favorably than another, or would have been treated in a comparable situation, et cetera, based on a protected characteristic. So if you're familiar with theories of egalitarianism, then this corresponds quite nicely to formal equality. So the main idea of direct discrimination is to ensure that the protected characteristic is not used in decision making. So this is somewhat similar to disparate treatment in the US, but not exactly the same. Because a very important distinction is that in the EU, actually, direct discrimination does not require discriminatory intent. So this is a very different situation than if you have to prove that someone has discriminatory intent. Then we also have indirect discrimination. So this is a notion that looks more at the effects. So this could be interpreted as a form of substantive equality to some extent. So it's aimed to protect against proxy discrimination and to some extent structural injustice as well. But this is somewhat limited because there is this idea that you can, the final part of the sentence, that you can actually objectively justify any disparities. So to give a very typical example, I believe this was a case sometime where the police would say, oh, we only want to hire women. And then people were like, okay, that's direct discrimination. But then they said, okay, then we only want to hire people who are of a height of higher than 1.70 meters. And then it's like, oh, obviously that affects women more than men generally. In the Netherlands, not as much because we're pretty tall, but still, it does. Yeah, and it's also important to note, this was also new to me, that different characteristics are protected across different domains. So that might be interesting to know. Yeah, and so it's very important to know that the difference between direct and indirect discrimination is that in indirect discrimination, there's also an allowance of a justification of disparities. And I don't know if Jeremiah has entered the room by now, but actually their paper is exactly about this distinction between direct and indirect discrimination. So I would highly recommend reading it, even if he doesn't show up for the presentation. So the main premise of the paper, well, not main premise, but one of the things we really wanted to highlight is that the law is not a decision tree. So myself as a computer scientist, I mostly know about the law from watching TV, and then it usually looks a lot like, oh, if you do this, then you will be jailed, or whatever. You know, it feels very like an if-then structure. But this is only a very limited conception of how the law actually works. And in the EU specifically, it's really important to know that in non-discrimination law, the court hardly relies on statistical evidence and instead uses legal reasoning based on the specifics and the context surrounding a case. So generally, you can see, so this is more for the computer scientists in the audience, we can distinguish between statutory law, which are like the things that you're maybe more familiar with. So these are the actual written regulations and directives that make up EU non-discrimination law. These could be modeled as a decision tree, somewhat, but a very high-level decision tree, and it cannot really explicitly cover all potential cases. And this is by design, because the point is to make sure that you can actually do a context-based assessment. And then there's the case law, and this is all the previous judicial decisions that were rendered in similar cases in the past. So this is way too specific to model as a decision tree, unless you make like a very deep decision tree, and that doesn't really apply to other scenarios. But it's also important to know that the court is sometimes opaque and even inconsistent with regard to the criteria that are used to decide what makes two cases similar. So what we did is we tried to look at a few typical examples of algorithmic unfairness and then highlight how EU non-discrimination law would look at those. So the first one is the Dutch childcare benefit scandal, where nationality was used directly in a fraud detection algorithm. So this would probably fall under direct discrimination, and it's covered by Article 21 of the Charter of, I don't remember exactly what it's called. I'm the computer scientist, I'm sorry. But what is interesting in this case specifically is not necessarily the law itself, but also more practical issues, like how can you get sufficient evidence to show that there actually is a case of prima facie discrimination? Because in this case, all the people individually were accused of fraud, but if you don't know that all the people who were committed a fraud kind of look like you, it's really hard to make a case. So this is one thing that's important to take into account. And then the second one we looked at was Amazon's hiring algorithm, or at least their prototype, I guess. So I think you're probably all familiar with this one, but this was a resume selection tool, and it penalized words like women's chess team. And this would probably could be considered a case of indirect discrimination, but maybe even direct discrimination as well. And the Court of Justice actually does not really treat this distinction consistently, and this is actually what the paper of Jeremiah is about, so I won't go into details. But again, we also get into this issue of how to show that there is a particular disadvantage. And we see that in EU case law, there's not a lot of statistics being used, so fairness metrics do not necessarily make a ton of sense here. And then when we look at gender shades, this gives an interesting question, like whether disparate product performance would fall within the EU non-discrimination law, and to some extent, I will not go into the details because of time, but we explore a little bit how that would be interpreted. And this actually also relates to Jan's presentation just now, because the court actually has never explicitly acknowledged intersectional discrimination, even though, in theory it could, but it has not ever done that. So this is also an important question. So what we really wanted to show here is that the court doesn't really rely on statistics and instead on this legal reasoning. And this brings us to what we refer to as the problem of emptiness, based on work by Peter Weston in the 1980s. And what we really want to highlight is that it's really important to make the normative choices very explicit, precisely because the court does not really rely on those statistics. So when we look at algorithmic fairness, we can see that different metrics give different answers to what should be equal between groups. So like demographic parity, it wants us to have equal selection rates between groups, so that gives the idea that receiving a benefit should not be dependent on sensitive group membership. In individual fairness, like what makes two cases equal, 100% is determined by what similarity metric you actually use. And many of these normative and empirical assumptions of the metrics and also of fairness-aware machine learning algorithms, they often remain implicit and underspecified. So then maybe the law could give us an answer to this. And to some extent it does. So we can see that, for example, there's no leveling down. And some quota-like interventions should only be limited to flexible quotas. But we also see there's not really a very systematic framework or normative baselines that the court uses, and we also see that there's some inconsistency between cases. So to get to some of the conclusions of our work, so first of all, we just really wanted to highlight to computer scientists that the law is not a decision tree and try to give a more elaborate answer than it depends. And then second of all, we really would like to see a focus where we shift questions from what should be equal between groups on why it should be equal between groups. So I think from both computer science perspective and from a legal perspective, it's really important to reflect on the normative goals of those interventions that we try to take. So the main question should be why a particular distribution is fair or not, and of course, who should bear the costs of inequality. So thank you for your attention.
All right, our next presentation will be the legal taxonomies of machine bias. Is it a video that's being shown? Yes. Yeah, no.
Legal taxonomies of machine bias, revisiting direct discrimination, by myself, Ruben Binnis, and my colleagues Jeremiah Sanders Bassel and Ashton Kelly Lane. There's a default assumption in machine learning fairness literature that ML fairness metrics map onto certain categories in discrimination. So in the US, there's a distinction between disparate treatment and disparate impact. Disparate treatment is where a person is treated
All right, and for our last talk this afternoon, Striving for Affirmative Algorithmic Futures by Annalena Thews.
Hey folks, can you hear me okay? Awesome, okay. Hey, my name is Annalena Thews. I'm a PhD candidate at Carleton University, and I'm going to shift the topic a little bit from the legal realm to the social sciences. I'm not quite sure why I'm in this panel, to be very honest, but here you go. One short thing right up front. The flowers have absolutely nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about, but I thought after 4 long days of many sessions and presentations, it would just be nice to look at some flowers and greenery. So here you go. Thank you. So my background is in human-computer interaction as well as in communication and media studies. And the overarching goal of my work, quite frankly, is to try to bring the computer sciences and human-computer interaction into much closer conversation with the social sciences. Because as it stands, the computer sciences and HCI, as well as the social sciences, are still often perceived as somewhat standalone and distinct domains, which I think is quite sad because they actually complement each other very, very well. And what I mean by that is that in my observation, the social sciences have a very keen eye for the complex forces that shape our diverse experiences. And they also really excel in uncovering an issue's history by kind of making sense of how the past has shaped the present. What is sometimes missing, though, is the practical application of this knowledge. And then on the other hand, we have computer science disciplines and human-computer interaction, which are very skilled at identifying existing issues and providing practical solutions, but they do sometimes miss to properly unpack the history and the evolution of a problem. And I want to be very clear that this is not an accusation or allegation, it's actually just an observation, because I believe nobody can do everything. And I also think we shouldn't expect that. But what this does mean is that we have a lot of domain-specific knowledge, while interdisciplinary socio-technical expertise is still a little scarce. So what I argue basically in this paper and consequently in this talk is that fostering interdisciplinary socio-technical knowledge and promoting a stronger connection between the social and computer sciences can support the design of algorithmic systems that result in more just outcomes and cultivate what I call affirmative algorithmic futures. And we have heard in the last couple of days in so many sessions the call for more interdisciplinary work, for more crosstalk, for people who know how to move around inside and outside of the data set. And I second that, no questions asked. But what has also have come to the forefront is that there's always this question of how do we actually do that? So what I'm introducing is kind of a knowledge collection, a compendium, quite frankly, that is aimed at doing exactly that, providing like the first step in trying to bridge the knowledge gap. I found the right button. So before we go into that, just quickly, what do I mean with when I say affirmative algorithmic futures? So I follow philosopher Rosi Brodotti's work on affirmative ethics here when I say that affirmative algorithmic futures describes futures in which we as a society have engaged with and learned from the damage that has been caused by the implementation of algorithmic technologies, from those who have suffered and those who have been excluded, and in which we have created new ways of living with algorithmic systems in more just and sustainable manners, striving first and foremost for doing no harm. And it is a response to a toxic technological solutionism, and it is always conscious and critical of the world in which algorithms are put to work, of the systems of power they are embedded in, and of the impact that our relationships with algorithmic systems have on the planet. And in the paper, I go in much more detail into what kind of futures we kind of tend to provoke when we introduce algorithmic systems in different contexts and how this differs from this vision of affirmative algorithmic futures, and of course invite you all to have a look. But for the sake of time, I'll just shortly say that, unsurprisingly to anybody here in the room, that when we introduce algorithmic systems in different contexts, the impact that they have on individuals differs vastly by person and context. But as we also have heard in many sessions in the last couple of days, they can also result and produce real harm. What I argue, though, is that these instances of algorithmic harm are not standalone occurrences in the sense that they are related in the fact, or in the sense that they are basically symptoms of a broken down system. And my reasoning is greatly informed by Ruha Benjamin's work that positions the glitch as a, quote, technological canary in the coal mine, end quote, a perfect quote, by the way, and a form of evidence that signals towards underlying flaws of a corrupted system. And my thinking also builds upon Louis Amour's work that recognizes moments in which algorithms tend to cross the threshold into madness as instances in which, and I quote again, algorithms give accounts of themselves and of their mode of reasoning, end quote. And what taking on this perspective really allows us to do is to trace these underlying mechanisms that result in discriminatory outcomes. And I'm going to focus on two of those. There are, of course, other factors that promote that, but I'll focus on those two. So one is the replication of an unjust past, and then we also have the application of technical fixes to social problems. And again, in the paper, I explain this, of course, in much more needed detail because these are very complex phenomena, but for the sake of time, I'll just really, really greatly condense it. So the replication of the unjust past describes the processes by which histories, systems, and production contexts that have led to normative assumptions, prejudices, and biases get manifested in algorithmic classification systems, which then go on to reproduce the status quo of systemic oppression and privilege while simultaneously discouraging alternative explorations of the future. I know it's dense, again, it's very condensed. So on the other hand, we have the application of technological fixes to social problems, and what I mean by that is that there tends to be an industry standard that is especially prevalent among the young tech startups in the Silicon Valleys of the world, but also in the tech industry at large, that deals with the effects of, or tends to deal with the effects of problems rather than with their causes, and also tends to reframe social struggles as engineering problems. So to kind of break out of these habits and to counter these dynamics that shape the development of many contemporary algorithmic systems, I'm introducing the Compendium of Socio-Technical Practices for Algorithmic System Design. And so this compendium is basically a compiled list of theoretical concepts, practical measures that have been proposed by many social scientists across many disciplines. And its primary goal is to promote knowledge mobilization, quite frankly, from the social sciences to the computer sciences, and to support the design of algorithmic systems that result in more just outcomes. Before I talk about the compendium in a little bit more detail, I really want to emphasize one point. This compendium is not an intervention that pretends to be another silver bullet that will solve all of our problems. Absolutely not. But what this compendium is instead is an example for how knowledge and expertise that has been developed in one domain can be made accessible for another field. So it's actually primarily, but of course not exclusively, aimed at computer scientists, engineers, HCI researchers, algorithmic system designers, and scholars that are looking for an entry point or an introduction into the social sciences with regard to algorithmic systems. And it's also a source of reference for everybody who's interested or already engaged in socio-technical research. So the compendium is structured into 4 sections. I'll just briefly explain what each of them does because the content is very dense, so I invite you, of course, to have a look at the paper. So the first section outlines social science scholarship that can be used to reframe algorithmic system design as more of a socio-technical practice, and how this then can inform more inclusive and non-discriminatory approaches to algorithmic system development. So for example, I lay out how concepts of feminist thought, such as situated knowledge or standpoint theory, or concepts such as social constructivism or theories from critical race studies are all very helpful to help to reframe our approach and the perspective of basically everybody who's kind of in the process designing these systems, and how this can help to think about the bigger social, cultural, political, environmental, institutional, at your preferred word, context in which a specific technology is introduced. So the second section is a long section that lists a lot of practical methods that can be directly adopted by researchers, designers, and scientists as methods for algorithmic system development, but also as tools for research and scholarship. So for example, among other things, this section introduces readers to guiding gut check questions, or a workshop framework that has been proposed, ethnographic approaches, and specific types of analysis that social scientists from across different disciplines have put forward. The third section offers suggestions for rhetoric changes to enable smoother communications between disciplines, because I think everybody who has ever done interdisciplinary work knows that establishing a baseline for what a word means is actually an interesting task. And finally, the fourth section lists potential venues, conference venues like this one, journals that support the dissemination and promotion of socio-technical interdisciplinary work. And of course, this compendium can never be exhaustive. I, of course, had to make decisions left and right. But I also envision this document as a living document that evolves and grows over time. So it actually comes with an open invitation to everybody in the room and to researchers and designers and practitioners to add additional approaches, methods, venues, new categories that reflect the growing body of knowledge about socio-technical algorithmic system design. So I guess the key takeaway really that I want to emphasize here is this. There is an entire trove of knowledge that the social sciences have produced that can actually have a very beneficial impact on algorithmic system design. And this paper and this compendium in particular are just an effort to making this knowledge accessible. Thank you.
If the authors would return to the front, we have a few moments for question and answer. If you all would have any questions and you want to come up to the mics that are here, we'd love to have you interact with the presentations that you just saw. Do we have any questions on Hopin? Wesley? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much. It looks like we'll end a little bit early today if we don't have any questions. And hopefully we'll see you all in the rest of the tracks today. Thank you.